Hey guys, in this quick tutorial we're going to go over the different ways to paint light and shadow in watercolor. The first thing to note is that the white of the page is our white in watercolor. This is something you always have to keep in mind, but don't worry too much because you can always use another medium to add white back if you accidentally paint over it, like white gouache, ink, acrylic, or my favorite, the Signo Broadpoint white gel pen. I'll leave links to all the supplies below. First, let's go over the basic way to make lighter and darker colors without layering. It's all about playing with the ratio of paint to water. So lots of paint and little water will make a dark shade. And then as you add more water to your brush and have less paint, you will gradually lighten the color. But if you have a lighter color like yellow, for example, the problem is it will never be darker than what the color looks like on your palette. So the secret is to use a different color that is either next to it on the color wheel or a variation of the color. So for example, you can use this yellow ochre, or a brown, or if you want to be even more loose and vibrant, you can use orange. Or better yet, you can mix the color you want to use. And if you want to make an even darker shadow, just mix it with the color opposite of it on the color wheel, and have more of the dominant color in the mix. This will make either a nice grayish or brownish color that still has some color in it. And if you want to make an actual black, then you can mix all three primary colors: magenta, cyan, and yellow. If you add more magenta or cyan or yellow in the mix, it will be more like that color. So that way you don't get a boring black. I went over this in my color mixing class. I'll leave a link to it below. The other way to darken your colors is to layer or glaze. This is the most popular and traditional way because it's easier to control and you can make subtle value differences that are fully controlled by you for a more realistic look. Since watercolor is transparent, when it overlaps with another dry layer, it becomes darker. That's really the basics of it. When doing this, keep in mind that colors will also mix by overlapping because watercolors are transparent. So the traditional way to paint in watercolor is by working from light to dark in layers. I showed this spear in my Anyone Can Watercolor class, and the challenge was only to use one color to keep it monochrome and to get different values from one color. But as you can see, the spear is not realistic because we only used one color, and that color is a light one. The main impulse is to add black or diluted black paint, which is gray, and yes, that would give it a better feeling of realism, but it'll also look uninteresting. I try to never use black in my art unless it's black ink for contrast. As artists, we are tasked in seeing colors that are more subtle, and even making them more interesting than they actually are in real life. And shadows are rarely black or gray. For example, you can see the subtle shades of blue and purple in these shadows of the clouds. If I up the saturation, it's easier to notice. But this is definitely a skill, and observation is something you have to develop to be an effective artist, and the only way to do that is by practicing. Most shadows do have subtle colors in them, and if they don't, add them in because it's boring without them. That's why whenever I paint something white, I use blues and purples to show shadows instead of gray. So back to the spear. We're gonna do what I showed you guys earlier with the yellow color. Instead of black, you could use Payne's gray. It's a nice variation of it. Or you can mix it with a different kind of blue, or mix it with its complement color, which is the opposite on the color wheel, like I showed earlier, to paint in the darkest parts. In this way, you still have colors in your darks, and it actually will be more realistic. Now, layering or glazing is the most important way to shade, but I prefer to use a variation of the wet and wet method instead, because I like to work more loose. You just paint in your shape with the lightest color, careful to leave the white of the page or use masking fluid, and then drop in more color for the darker parts while it's still wet. You can also add more than one color, and I usually do this, and use a dry brush to lift excess paint or water and essentially erase it. Depending on how wet your first layer is, this paint will spread more or less and how much water you have on your brush. It's just something you have to practice. Another variation is to work backwards from how most people use watercolor. Instead of light to dark, we're using dark to light. So just put down the shadows first, notice how I use two colors here, and then use water to make a gradient and make it blend out to the white of the page. The two methods are almost the same, and it's up to you which way you like more. But keep in mind that I paint loosely and I like bleeds and fun color combos, so wet and one layer paintings dominate my work. If you want to be more realistic, layering is the way to go. If you want to be more loose, one layer painting is more suited. But there are exceptions to every rule, and you can really do whatever you want, and I've seen artists do it in so many different ways. I will leave you with two last tips. The first tip is to squint your eyes when looking at your subject to see values. When you squint your eyes, it's easier to see value changes because they get grouped together and you can ignore all the detail. I always use this technique when trying to see values, especially in colored images, which can be more difficult. If it's very hard for you to see values, I recommend you paint something in black and white, using first a black and white image, and then you can work your way up to color and try doing colored ones. It's going to be hard at first, but the more you do it, the better you'll get. The second tip is to use cool colors in your background or cast shadows, like green and blue. Cooler colors tend to recede and warmer colors pop out at us. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this super concentrated lesson, and it will help you in your future paintings. Just remember that the most important rule in art is to have fun, and if you want to improve quickly, just do it often. So experiment, play, and do your thing. Just have fun with it. I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Stay awesome, and happy painting!